the formation of the state's first suffrage association in Earlville, a little town in LaSalle County, west of Chicago. A woman named Susan Hoxie Richardson, who was Susan B. Anthony's cousin, and a graduate of Oberlin College, lived in Earlville, and that's why we think it probably started there. This didn't really take, though. This small beginning didn't have any legs. It kind of just diffused. There was some talk in those early years, but it didn't really, nothing much happened after this meeting. It's really in 1869, with the founding of the Illinois Women's Suffrage Association and the first convention in Chicago, when things really start to solidify in Illinois around suffrage. But I want to back up a second, because in these in-between years, we have a couple of important things that are happening. Between 1855 and 1869, the Civil War happens. So let's look at that, because this also has to do with the Women's Club story. In 1868, Cirrhosis, a Chicago Women's Club, was formed in part to advance the cause of women's rights. And the group began formulating plans for a state convention. Organizational disputes soon splintered the group, and two groups resulted, and they hosted simultaneous women's rights conventions in Chicago in February of 1869. Both of the conventions were attended by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, and they gave speeches and talked to the women. And part of the dispute was a national dispute around in the suffrage movement. And it was in those years following the Civil War over issues and strategies, and whether African-American men should be granted suffrage in the 15th Amendment, which was one of three main amendments that granted broader rights and broader protection to the formerly enslaved people freed during the war. So this dispute over whether Black men should get the right to vote splinters the national women's suffrage movement, because they believe, many suffragists believe, that they should be included, that Black women should be included in granting those rights in the 15th Amendment, and that the introduction of gender into the amendment in the Constitution was a real problem. This would be the first time that something was specifically restricted. So this splinters the movement. That splintering comes to Chicago, and those two conventions are held. But in Illinois, the result is really one Women's Suffrage Association. So regardless of the splintering, they gathered their forces together, and in 1869, this Illinois Women's Suffrage Association is formed. And that is what becomes the leading suffrage organization in the state. If you notice, it's a women's club that starts the discussion. And this is what happens in Chicago, is where suffrage is still considered such a radical thing to request that it often causes some difficulty in the club movement. And women's clubs really struggle with retaining all of their members, even though they want to work, many of them want to work towards this, increasing these rights, but not everyone supports this. It's too pushy. You're moving too fast. You're asking too much. So many women's clubs, rather than splintering, decide not to take a stand. They decide to stay neutral and not say whether they're pro or con. And many members then go on and work in the suffrage organizations rather than working in the club about this. So the clubs stay neutral, the women form separate suffrage organizations, and then they work on it outside. Someone has a question? Go ahead. Yeah.
Okay.
I can't hear you. Yeah.
I'm so sorry. Yeah. I'm waving and I'm raising my hand.
Yeah.
So in the chat from the question is, what side of the split did the IWSA represent?
they decided, well, they're obviously pro-suffrage. They're working for suffrage. What Cirrhosis and the other women's clubs in Chicago, they decide not to say either way. So if you want to work for suffrage, you join the IWSA and you work for suffrage there. You're not working on it within the women's club itself. So that's the way they resolve it. And it's interesting to watch that it stays the same over time. The Chicago, I'll talk a little about the Chicago Women's Club and other women's clubs in a minute. But that's really what the main, move is to separate out the suffrage work from the club. So in these years, this is Frances Willard is a key figure in this time period. And I'm going to talk about several women who are key figures, including Willard. Willard is born in 1839. She's the generation between Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony. They're her mother's generation, and Jane Addams, names you might know, and Ida B. Wells, who are the next generation. So Willard is the in-between. Willard's in the group of women who are starting to get educated. They're getting some formal education. Some of them are attending colleges. Willard attends a small women's college in Evanston. That's what brings her to Evanston. She stays in Evanston the rest of her life, along with her family. So Willard is sort of an in-between figure. Women are starting to move out of the home and out of the church and doing other things within the public world, but the public world and action in the public world is still restricted to them. When the women's temperance movement starts in the 1870s is when Willard really starts to see that public action for women can be taken, and that this is a way for women to work on something that's still considered acceptable or within the woman's sphere. So temperance is the anti-alcohol movement. It really becomes an active women's movement in the 1870s. After the Civil War, the problems of alcohol for families are starting to really grow and become apparent, and women decide that they can do something, that they don't have to join the men's temperance organizations that already exist. They can create a new effort that's run and led by women. And Willard becomes the second president of the Women's Christian Temperance Union in 1879, an entirely women-led, women-run organization, working for temperance, working for lots of social reforms. Willard brings the WCTU into the suffrage movement, or brings the suffrage movement to the WCTU. So among all the social reforms that they're working on, she says we have to work for the right to vote. Nothing's going to happen for women if women don't have rights to speak up for themselves and create openings for themselves in the political world to make change. So her move towards suffrage is at first considered such a radical move. The organization doesn't go along with her. She has to persuade them that this is something women should do. And she does that by creating a really unique argument. Oh, sorry, I moved forward. Around suffrage. She says that women should be working on suffrage because it's part of their role as women, as wives, mothers, and daughters. Certainly, they should be allowed to vote on issues that have to do with the home. Like, why shouldn't they be voting for school board? They're the most connected to their children's lives and know what their children need in their education. Women certainly should be voting for the school systems in their communities. Why shouldn't they be deciding whether or not there's a saloon down the street from their house? That directly impacts their home. She calls this the home protection ballot. Women should be given a partial ballot. They don't need to vote on everything, but just the things that affect the home. Certainly that's not too much to ask. And you can tell in my voice that she's both arguing this and she sees it as a strategy. This is a strategy. This is what's called a wedge strategy for change. You get the door open a little bit, women are voting, and they will get more rights and more voting. If we ask for just a expansion of our rights. No one can accuse us of being too radical. We're not asking for the moon. We're just asking for this set of things that affect us directly and having some power over those things. And that's not too much. So this is an extremely influential strategy. This not only does this work to advance the suffrage cause in general, it gets lots of women working for suffrage because they think, well, hey, she's right. We should be voting for these things. These are about our lives. We should be able to say whether or not these things happen and why, and for our children. And lots of women join the WCTU and join this cause because they see it as a way to do the work without going too far. So it's really important moment in the suffrage movement. This really carries the suffrage movement into the 1890s. So the Women's Christian Temperance Union is a powerhouse in these years. And Willard, by the 1890s, it's the largest organization of women in the world. It's a worldwide organization by this time, grows dramatically. This is really before the Women's Club movement starts. So you can see there's this in-between time where women are trying to figure out what's their public role, how do they work in the world. The Women's Club movement really takes off in the 1890s, and it takes over from the WCTU in the early 20th century. So that's sort of the Women's Club story. It's coming right around the same time. So really important moment in 1890, the Illinois Women's Suffrage Association changes its name to the Illinois Equal Suffrage Association and transforms its mission from political equality with men to political enfranchisement with women. Equality is something people debate. Are women equal, or do they just deserve the same kinds of rights? Equal might be a little too pushy. Once again, we're debating how far we go. And the shift highlights a reorientation of the women's movement with new arguments. In 1891, Illinois women are granted the right to vote for school boards and school offices. Very important. Remember that wedge strategy. You get the door open a little bit, and once you're voting, that produces more voting. That's the argument. That's the case they're making. And so Illinois women start running for school board and voting for school board in those first years after 1891. And the Chicago Women's Club forms a separate organization, very powerful. It becomes really the leading suffrage organization in the state, the Chicago Political Equality League in 1894. So really, once again, the Women's Club says, you know what, we're spinning our suffrage work off. It's going to be a separate place where if you want to work for suffrage, you're going to do it there. So another key figure based in Evanston these years is Catherine Waugh McCulloch. She's born in 1862. She's that next generation after Willard that I was mentioning. She has new ideas. She actually goes to law school. She gains her law degree. I mean, these women are now gaining not just education, but real higher education and moving into fields traditionally unavailable to them. Willard could no more have thought about being an attorney than anything. But by this time, McCulloch becomes an attorney. She has trouble getting a job with a law firm. So she and her husband form their own law firm, and they work on issues that are faced by women by the fact that women don't have legal rights or equal legal rights. And so she takes on a whole slew of issues through her work as an attorney. Not only does she do that, she knows how to read the Illinois Constitution. She knows how to understand how the legal process works. She studies the way you get a law passed in Springfield, and it's Catherine McCulloch who takes that home protection ballot idea, that idea of partial suffrage, and turns it to the advantage of Illinois women. But hang on to that thought because I'll get back there in a minute. So in these years, just so you can get a picture of what's going on throughout the country, Wyoming Territory grants women the right to vote from the beginning of its formation as a territory. And then when it becomes a state in 1890, it stays, women's suffrage stays as part of the state constitution. Same thing with Utah. Colorado does the same thing when it becomes a state, and Idaho, Washington, and California, and Oregon, Kansas, and Arizona are granting women the right to vote in their state constitutions in these years. This doesn't get a whole lot of attention from the national political parties because there are not enough women in these states to really influence elections. Even though women are voting, and now they're voting in their state elections, they're changing their communities' laws, it doesn't move up high enough into the national political sphere for it to cause much ruffling of feathers, especially in the national political parties. But when Illinois starts considering granting women an expanded right to franchise, people start paying attention. There are lots of women living in Illinois, and they're going to make an impact if they're voting. There's a move to get women right to vote in Chicago alone. That's a big movement in 1909. And this time period is when we really start to see a change in the way suffrage strategy is happening in the state. So the Chicago Political Equality League mobilizes women around this 1909 municipal suffrage, and this expands the number of women, the women who are working for suffrage. So you start to see African American women working for suffrage in Chicago. You start to see labor union women working for suffrage. A broad coalition of organizations and women are working together. It doesn't succeed. The suffrage doesn't pass in 1909, but that coalition bringing in all these different women together to work for it really changes the suffrage movement in the state. So even though you have separate organizations, all those organizations are coming together to work for women's suffrage. And then Grace Wilbur Trout, who is from Oak Park, gets elected president, and then president of the Chicago Political Equality League, and then president of the Illinois Equal Suffrage Association. And Grace Wilbur Trout brings a different set of ideas and strategies that are really important in these years. She is also that next generation, but she is her husband is a wealthy merchant in the city of Chicago, and they are well connected. She's not a professional woman. She's educated, but she isn't a working woman. She brings those connections, those social connections. She's also very media savvy. She's well connected to newspapers and other journalists in the city, and she starts to build a media strategy, something we would probably recognize today. But she's starting back in 1909, figuring this out. So she starts to do publicity stunts. She does auto tours around the state. That whole image we have of suffrage, of the white dresses and the sashes and the big hats, that comes from this time period. It really doesn't come from the earlier time period. That's this time period. They're being photographed. Those photographs are being printed and distributed. They are thinking about the imagery. They're thinking about the color, the pageantry. They're trying to make their presence known in a whole new way. Something we find familiar, but was brand new at this time. And this strategy, Trout is also, not only is she a media savvy person, she's very politically savvy. She starts to realize that she can advocate for suffrage by working closely with legislators in Springfield. She can work in their districts to gain a suffrage supporter in each one of their districts. So she's not coming to them from Chicago. They're hearing from someone in their own town or in their own county, in their district, who's a supporter of suffrage. So this is personal to them. They're hearing from someone who might know their mother or their sister or their wife, and be connected in some kind of women's club that way. And this whole strategy that Trout has changes the landscape in Illinois. She is instrumental with Catherine Wall McCulloch in writing and then getting passed this 1913 suffrage bill that grants Illinois women the right to vote in all the elections not prohibited in the Constitution, in the state constitution. This means that the state constitution doesn't have to be changed, which is a very difficult thing to do at this time in Illinois, and actually still is. So, so this is granting women the right to vote. Constitution doesn't need to be changed, and it includes one key, very powerful vote. Women are voting in Illinois for presidential electors. And if you know anything about our electoral system, that means you're voting for president. And people nationwide stand up and pay attention, because this means that the presidential election is going to have women voting for it the next time around, and lots of women, and lots of Black women too. So this changes the landscape. It's not an accident that you get this vote in Illinois in 1913 and you get an amendment in 1919 that passes in 1920. It's 72 years of fighting that is condensed down into a short amount of time. So this 1913 vote is not something people know a whole lot about. It's not talked about a lot, but it was very important in this. New York women aren't voting yet. New York scrambles, wants Illinois women. No one wants just Illinois women voting for president. By 1916, Illinois women are voting. By 1917, New York women are voting. So very interesting how that all comes together. And Illinois is the first state east of the Mississippi. A key figure also in these years is Ida B. Wells. She's in that next generation. She's with Grace Wilbur Trout, Catherine McCulloch and Wells, Jane Addams, that women are educated, coming out of difficult, complicated situations, but working hard to gain their rights. Wells's suffrage work really starts with that 1891 school board vote. She recognizes what kind of power has been given, and she starts to activate Black women in the city of Chicago around that right, that new right. But Wells's work sort of takes a different path. She's got different issues to deal with, and she surfaces again in the suffrage movement in the state around the 1913 vote. And there's a great story, you'll see this if you watch that American Experience, the vote, about what happens when Wells travels to Washington, D.C. for a suffrage parade, and she's asked to march at the back of the march with other Black women, not as part of the Illinois delegation where she rightfully belongs, and what her response is. She refuses to do such a thing. She joins the march halfway. Wells never brooked any kind of lack of respect for her place and her part. And she always demanded it, and rightfully so. But she had many, many colleagues in Illinois who were supporters and worked with her. This was a broad network that Wells was part of. In Illinois, the suffrage movement is happening because lots of women are working on it all together. Not that there wasn't issues and discrimination, of course there was, but it looks a little different when you tell the story from Illinois. So I want to wrap up because I know I'm right about on time. I encourage you to explore the story of the suffrage march. Very interesting moment in national suffrage work. And then leading up into these years, we have two important suffrage parades that happen in the city of Chicago. Then because Illinois women are voting, a lot of suffrage work shifts to Chicago in these years. So the national suffrage organizations use Chicago and Illinois women to gain national publicity for now what they're working on, which is the 19th Amendment to the Constitution. It's not an accident that Illinois is the first state to ratify the 19th Amendment when it gets passed and sent to the states in 1919 in June. June 10th, there are 3 states that ratify on that first day: Illinois, Wisconsin, and Michigan, in that order. Very interesting that it's the 3 Great Lakes states that ratify on June 10th, the very first day that you can ratify. And then August 26th, a whole year later, because those June dates are 1919, it takes a year and a few months for it to be fully ratified throughout the United States, and it becomes law. And that's the anniversary we celebrated last year. So I'm happy to take questions or comments or answer any further questions, but I hope this gives you an idea of how critical it was that this all happened here and what an important role Illinois played in the story. So
How wonderful and informative. And that was a lot of information, Lori.
yeah.
A lot to process and listen to. I took
And
my notes,
I'll stop sharing now. That's what I'll do.
Okay,
there we go. Great.
So let's go ahead and open it up to questions, comments. You will have to unmute yourselves to do so. So anyone have a question they'd like to ask or a comment? I can start it off. Go ahead, Sophie.
Hi, it's Sophie. Thanks, Lori. That was so interesting. Thank you for sharing the information. I guess what I'm sitting here thinking about are, specific to the Wilmette Women's Club and the League of Women Voters, and how, back in the day, we kind of helped get that organization going. So now I'm wondering, listening to this, is that what happened? Then they splintered off into
that might have been.
Right. Yeah.
And the League of Women Voters in most communities comes out of the suffrage organization that was there already. That's true in Evanston, that's true in Chicago, that once suffrage passes, there's a whole effort. And the League of Women Voters nationally is actually founded in Chicago in 1919. Before the National League of Women Voters is formed, before women have the right to vote. But there's enough women voting that they want to be sure that women are informed voters. So they have a very similar mission to what they have today. But the National League is formed ahead of the whole country gaining the right to vote. Yeah, but most of the leagues are the legacy organization of whatever suffrage organization there was. Not all of them, but a lot of them.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
That's very interesting. I know we must have some more questions.
I have a question.
Yeah, and I'm happy to go back. I know it was a lot of information to skim through.
I have a question.
So, yeah.
So I have a question, not 100% relating to voting, but I wonder, in your work, do you ever come across the name of a woman, Ina Law Robertson?
I haven't heard of her.
She was in the generation of Jane Addams, and I think they actually were friends. So I actually used to work for, my first job out of college was with the Eleanor Association. So if there's any Chicagoans here, that was an organization that this woman started for women who were moving to Chicago and didn't have a place to live or didn't have a network. They were professional women. So this was in the late 1800s that she did this. So it was very, she was like the women you're talking about.
Yeah.
She sort of ran in the same circle, so to speak.
Yeah. The Eleanor clubs, I think there was a number of Eleanor clubs.
There were, there was one in particular in the Gold Coast area that was the actual original residence. There was another one that turned into the Art something Women's Club. But it was a phenomenal organization, because the women that I worked with, I was their marketing director. Just a little side note. It was really phenomenal because I worked with this group of women that were all 80 to 90 years old. So they were actually a part of the Eleanor Association when they were like in their 30s. and they were now doing charity work in Chicago, raising money, and they were just phenomenal people to work with for somebody
Yeah.
just out of college. But it was really cool, really interesting.
The whole issue of women actually moving somewhere and working was a problem for people.
Yes.
The idea that you would live on your own,
Yes.
not acceptable. You're not looking for an apartment downtown
Right.
and working as a secretary. You have to figure out your housing, and you are not going to be living by yourself. So there were many strategies for housing women. There are several places where women could live. The Catholic Women's Club here in Evanston, there were multiple houses. And not just for white women, but Black women too.
Yeah.
If you're migrating and you're single, you need to know where you're going to live before you, because otherwise you might slip into a life of, or be swept into a life that no one would want you to live. So that was a real danger, or perceived danger at the time. So yeah, the YWCA was also an organization formed to provide that kind of housing too.
Right. Anyway, I just wondered if you came across her. She was.
Yeah, no, I haven't heard of her, but I'm not an expert on Chicago women's history. So I know a lot, but I wouldn't call myself an expert. I'm sure there are people who do know about, I know there are people who know about the Eleanor Club. So.
Yes.
Okay, we just had a question or a comment in the chat, and I'm having trouble getting back to it. I don't know if anyone else can see.
Yeah, the Wheatley home. A colleague of mine at the Willard House, we were talking about the Wheatley home. Wheatley home, Phyllis Wheatley home was named for Phyllis Wheatley, African-American poet. Was a settlement house on the south side, one of the few remaining buildings in the Black settlement house movement, and is being threatened with demolition today. So if you want to know more, the Tribune, I think, has been covering it. Preservation Chicago, Landmarks Illinois, really important building. Women's history is everywhere and really is not represented well in our historic landscape and the monuments and markers. Just think about all these stories, very little to show in that. So there's lots of efforts to make that different, to change that today. And the Willard House is among part of that effort. So.
Very interesting. I
all must vote. I agree.
Yes.
I hope that is the lesson that you take away for today, how hard people fought for the right. And you can best remember this by realizing how critical it is to use it today.
It's really something. There's so much history, and how hard they all fought for so long is amazing.
Yeah, and one of the things I don't think people realize, even with all those white hats and sashes and everything, this up until the very end was considered too much. Women should not be asking for such a right. And This is 1919, 1920, just 100 years ago. So this is not something people accepted and said, oh, of course. This was a battle to the very end. And many people still didn't want it. It took a year and 2 months for that amendment to pass. And it only passed because someone in Tennessee finally said, okay. So this wasn't a done deal, even in this time. Seems so obvious to us, but wasn't then.
Right. And all the different levels and layers when you get into it. Very interesting.
And they tried everything they could think of. With 70 years to work on it, they tried every strategy they could think of to get it done. So, yeah.
Okay. So I had a question that somebody emailed to me after they registered.
Oh.
And we
Yeah.
get this question quite a bit, and I think I know the answer, but I would like to have your answer to this. So, and I'm assuming it's tradition that it's not a women's club, it's a woman's club.
Oh, yeah.
So I would love to have a more concise answer to give people when they ask that question.
Yeah. It's because each woman counts.
That's, oh, okay, that is definitely more concise than the answer I gave, but that's the idea.
It's the Women's Christian Temperance Union, the Women's Club of Evanston. It's the women's suffrage movement. Now we updated the language because people go, well, that, and spell check doesn't like it when you use
Right.
the A. But that's why it's woman. Each woman counts.
I love, okay. Each
So
woman counts. I love that.
So
Yeah.
that's why that A is still there. Lots of people have changed it. It's okay, but I kind of like trying to keep that old spelling. It gives it retains that meaning.
Right. Right. Okay, well, that was my thought, but that is a much better way to say it. So thank you. Thank you. Any other questions or comments for Lori?
Well, it's been fun to share. I'm sorry that it got all messed up and that was very stressful, I'm sure, but it worked out okay.
Definitely appreciate everybody being understanding, especially you, Lori. Thanks for being flexible. And I can't wait till things are open again and we can visit.
Yeah. So right now you can actually see some of this story on the walls at the Evanston History Center. The Evanston History Center at the Charles Gates Dog House is open by appointment. You need to make a reservation, but you can see the exhibit that I worked on, which is focused on Evanston women and the fight for the vote. And some of it will be familiar from what I just said. You can see the story, but it's an exhibit. It has pamphlets and brochures and other things that we have from our collection. So you can see some of that suffrage paraphernalia and those arguments on paper. So go to the Evanston History Center website if you want to get out of the house, and the exhibit will only be up through May. It's been up for more than a year, and I think it's been open for a total of 3 months of the year. So anyway, but you can see it online too. EvanstonWomen.org is the website, and then the Willard House hopefully will be open again in the summer. So just stay in touch if you want to see a great historic house, and there's lots about us on the website too. So
we'll definitely put that on my list of things to do when we're
out and about.
Yes.
I know. It'll be so nice.
So nice. And when the weather goes back to the way it was before it played this nasty trick on us, it'll be even nicer.
Today wasn't that good.
So
all right.
Great. Lori, thank you so very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks to everyone for attending. Great. Bye-bye.